Well, I want to thank you all for coming out, and I want to thank Rob for organizing this series, and Len and Julian for starting it off and keeping it going, and my friend Alan Berry for supporting it, and also for supporting the Thinking Out of the Lunchbox series down at the Downtown Library. Now, exactly 3 weeks ago, I stood here about to give the Berry lecture. And I opened my bag, and I looked in, and all I could find was this shoe with some stuff written on the bottom. And I searched around, and there was no paper in there. So I went back to my office to see if I could find the paper, asking you to patiently wait. Came back, no paper there. I came back, and I apologized. Could not give the paper, and I asked you, to forgive me. And then I woke up. Now I'm looking. Yep. This is what I was looking for. And I want to start out by saying that was one intense experience to have gone through. Philosophy has an intimate relation with experience, but it's often had a very narrow understanding of what that means. If we were to embrace rich and complex experiences like dreams, what would follow? I mean, Freud did that, but Freud was very dismissive of philosophy. We can perhaps learn something from dreams, but can we learn anything philosophical? If you read Huang Tzu, you just hear about the man who dreamt that he was a butterfly, and then worried that maybe he was a butterfly dreaming that he was a man. And that road is a very interesting road. So there is something philosophically interesting about dreams. But I don't want to specifically focus on dreams. I want to focus on, let's say, rich and interesting experiences. And I want to start out by saying that when I was an undergraduate, I picked up A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth and Logic, which he wrote in 1936 when he was 24 years old. And I was just bowled over. He was a guy who was telling me that I could forget everything my parents had ever said, anything that the tradition has ever said, because any statement that was worth anything had to be able to be verified through experience. And what he meant by experience were sense data, atomic sense data, that had the sort of minimal information content, and he would sort of stick them together, and eventually, if you're lucky, you might be able to reconstruct something like science. I then came across Husserl's phenomenology when I was studying in Manchester, and that really got me going, because here this phenomenological account of experience was much richer and wasn't atomic and seemed to have much more room for complexity. And then I went to Oxford, and unbelievably, Ayer was still alive, and I went to one of his lectures, and this is like 35 years after he'd written that first book, and he talked about an experience. He's sitting at his desk writing, and then he thought, because it was England, time for a cup of tea, and he put his pen down, and it rolled off the back of the desk. No problem. So he went down to find it on his knees, couldn't find the pen, so he pulled the desk out from the wall. Anyway, to cut a long story short, he never found the pen. And he concluded that either it was an object with a sort of fixed lifespan that was like renting its space in the universe, or that it had disappeared down a wormhole. And I thought, yes, that's the Ayer that I really like. This is the new man. So what would it be like to have a bigger sense, a broader sense of what experience is about? What if we were not focused on certainty, on the constructing of secure knowledge from stripped down building blocks, But we were more interested in exploring meaning, possibilities of thinking, shapes of selfhood, and so on. On this model, philosophical questioning is not like practical or scientific questioning. The point is to keep questions alive, not to answer them, or to keep them alive by answering them in a way that keeps debates continuing. And this is why I read people in the 19th century like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and why I carry on reading people like Wittgenstein and Derrida and Heidegger. Wittgenstein famously once wrote, "Back to the rough ground," urging us to pay more attention to the complexity of everyday language, to the limits of abstract formulations, and to the full-blooded contexts in which philosophical problems seem to arise. Philosophy would consist in, as he called it, assembling reminders. And I want to address experience today with this same sort of back to the rough ground sensibility. So, why this pair, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche? Well, I mean, the interest in them is, the superficial interest is that they were both very popular 19th century philosopher figures. Neither of them actually had proper academic jobs, and one of them looks like a serious, religious nut, and the other one seems to be a sort of hard-nosed atheist. And they both had extraordinary impacts outside philosophy. I mean, the list of people they influenced, I have lists and lists of names here in front of me, but I won't go through them. Another reason is, well, I remember once, again, when I was a student, picking up a copy of Joseph Heller's Catch-22 in a bookstore, and I turned it over, and on the back it said, "Read this book, and you'll never be the same again." And that really got me thinking, like, did I want to be the same again? or what were they appealing to here? And I'm reminded, and in a sense, I would say, read these philosophers, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and very much the same consequence can be expected. And here I think I want to just very briefly take issue with something that my dear friend John Locke said many, many years ago, that you may have changed your mind now, John, but I think you said, "Don't scratch where it doesn't itch." And this is the way philosophy should conduct itself. And I think both of these guys are saying exactly the opposite. If it doesn't itch, you got a problem. In other words, it should be itching. And philosophy will help you. That's the assault view. Yes, philosophy will help you learn to itch if you don't already. Now, I have to apologize for what I'm about to do, because I'm going to give you, especially for the professional philosophers in the audience, incredibly potted versions of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, which are totally unprofessional, but will give you something at least to hang on to. So I'm going to work through these characters and then add significant comments. Okay, is there any light? Way of adjusting light. Right, is it here? Oh. I just want, no, the opposite really. Yeah, that work? Okay. Yeah, so Kierkegaard was born in Copenhagen in about 1813. He was a Danish Christian writer, thinker, philosopher, social critic, theologian, and father of existentialism. He lived with a sense of impending doom, losing many of his siblings at an early age. He's famous for championing the significance of human existence in the face of alienating social institutions, especially the established church in what he called Christendom, and also totalizing philosophical systems like that of Hegel, which privileged the standpoint of the whole over that of the existing individual, as he called it. Kierkegaard wrote about anxiety, about the subjectivity of truth, about love, about the virtues of marriage, and about selfhood. His relationship to God was central to all his work, and it was only possible, he says, through what has been called a leap of faith. He distinguishes various levels of human existence, the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious, and he develops the idea of an ideal of the knight of faith. Although he was hostile to Hegel, he was a dialectical thinker who thought we could work through each stage of life's way until the possibility of the next stage, as it were, popped out as a possibility. He wrote under many pseudonyms, each representing, if you like, a limited take on life, and he did this as a very powerful and effective rhetorical strategy. He inherited money, he lived as a writer, never had a real job, and famously broke off his engagement with the one woman with whom he seems to have connected, Regina Alton. He was also an eccentric local celebrity. Boys, apparently, would throw things at him in the street. His most famous books are Fear and Trembling, Sickness Unto Death, The Concept of Dread, including unscientific postscript, he had a sense of humor, Either Or, which included Diary of a Seducer, and Works of Love. And I want to begin by describing something dramatic that happened to him, which is his earthquake. And this is a quote from his journal. It's on the front here. Yeah. Then it was that the great earthquake occurred, the terrible revolution, which suddenly forced upon me a new and infallible law of interpretation of all the facts. I suspected that my father's great age was not a divine blessing, but rather a curse. There must have been a guilt upon the whole family. And it seems that what this refers to is the fact that his father told him when he was in his early 20s that there was something about his past that he didn't know, which he should know. And we still don't know quite what this was, but we think that it's either one or both of the following. That A, his father cursed God on the heath early on because of all the deaths in the family, I suppose. And the second is that it's very likely that his father had an affair with his wife's maid before his wife then died. He then married the maid and had the kids, including Kierkegaard. So he'd actually had an illicit sexual relationship with his maid. And I guess the point of all this is this was an earthquake to somebody who saw his father as this paragon of uprightness and so on. And of course it may have made him feel a bit strange about his background. Anyway, this is where he comes to think that maybe the whole family was cursed. Now the significance of this experience seems to have been to have shaken the foundations of his understanding of self, much as the Lisbon earthquake in 1755 sent tremors through the faithful of Europe. How could God have let that happen? We might suppose, for example, that we have a self, however we acquire it, and subsequently from that little island we can reach out to others. But what if selfhood is constitutionally, intrinsically, and continuingly, in a deep way, relational? This seems to have been the question posed by Kierkegaard's earthquake. If the ground of our being, in this case his relation to his father, can shift under our feet, what does that tell us? And it's just this question that he takes up twice in his writings. First in Fear and Trembling, in his discussion of the Abraham-Isaac story, and second in Sickness Unto Death. In Fear and Trembling, he dramatizes the various challenges to faith that might have been played out by the story as it comes down to us of Abraham's relation to Isaac. God, remember, has told Abraham to take Isaac to Mount Moriah and sacrifice him. Kierkegaard tells the story from Isaac's point of view, he tells the story from Abraham's point of view, and each time with various variations. The bottom line, Abraham has faith that however impossible it may seem, Isaac will be restored to him even after he's sacrificed him. His relationship to God was that tight. He cannot separate himself from his faith to God. Even at the symbolic register, he owes his name to God, having started out as just plain Abram. And then God said, I'm going to call you Abraham. Now, but it's in Sickness Unto Death in his other work, that this dependency issue becomes explicit. Kierkegaard begins by asserting that selfhood is reflexive, that we have a relation to ourselves. We think about what we do. We may feel guilty, ashamed, or proud. We're self-conscious, not just conscious. So far, so good. But then he asks this question: is this self-relatedness, this self-consciousness, is it autonomous? Is it something we can just do for ourselves and by ourselves? Or is it mediated by its relation to something else? Is there a third party involved? Consider pride at being wealthy or witty. It seems like a relationship that you have to yourself, you know. Really wealthy guy. Really witty guy, you know. It's just my feel about myself. But it actually depends on someone taking my money. I mean, this is what I call money. If nobody takes my money, if nobody laughs at my jokes, I'm not wealthy, I'm not witty. I need that third party. And what if that were true at a deeper level of selfhood? Kierkegaard has an argument from experience, a transcendental argument, as we call it, to demonstrate that this is so. Consider despair, he says. It takes two forms. I can, on the one hand, despair at willing to be myself. Or, on the other hand, I can despairingly will to be myself. So I can despair at willing to be myself, and I can despairingly will to be myself. If selfhood were just an autonomous self-relation, he argues, an island cut off from the main, as John Donne would have it, there would only be the first version. Despair would lead to madness or suicide, because I would despair at willing to be myself. Because there would be no sustaining or constitutive relation to anything else. But there is a second alternative, a second kind of despair called carrying on in despair, despairingly willing to be oneself. And this, he suggests, is only possible if our autonomy is actually grounded in a relation to another being. The power that constituted me, as he put it. If we're plugged into the grid, in other words, we can keep going, even when the batteries die. Now, there seems to be a gap in this argument. It seems to demonstrate not that we're constituted by a relation to some power, but that we can believe ourselves to be constituted. One could keep up one's spirits stranded on a desert island in the erroneous belief that help was on its way, and that could save one's life. Now, whether that power should be called God or not, what Kierkegaard's opening up is the whole question of this relation between self and other. And I interpolate here the remark. I keep referring to Wittgenstein. It's obviously an anticipation of José's talk. Wittgenstein once wrote, "We are dependent beings, and that on which we depend, we may call God." Very interesting. May call God. Can the work that God does for Kierkegaard be equally done by a good enough mother or father, or by friends, or by other members of your AA group? It paves the way for Levinas's claim in the 20th century that God could be thought to be located in my ethical relation to the other. Compare Heraclitus' claim that there are gods even in these flames. I'm saying that while Kierkegaard saw himself as a Christian thinker, he actually opens up the space in which that's not the only solution to the problem. In a late essay, The Singular Universal, Jean-Paul Sartre lavishes praise on Kierkegaard, saying that he taught him the importance of becoming an atheist, which we might gloss as honest passion at the absence of God. In other words, Sartre's turned on by the same question and gets his inspiration from Kierkegaard, even though Kierkegaard goes off in a different direction. Now, I note that in Kierkegaard's case, we have a report of an experience, that is his earthquake, and we've got my juxtaposition of this report with his various theoretical elaborations of structurally analogous scenarios, that is, Abraham and faith and despair and the self. In the Abraham case, we have the added complication of it being somebody else's experience distantly recorded. And we'll come back to this later. Now, I want to move on to talk about Nietzsche. And I believe, yep, here he is. Nietzsche was born in Prussia, 1844, lost a brother when he was 2 and his father when he was 5. He was a precocious student at high school, and at 24 he was appointed professor of classical philology at Basel. Ill health soon forced his retirement and plagued him all his life until he went mad and died young. He led a peripatetic existence, wandering the cities and mountains of Europe, especially Italy, looking for good air. He famously came to the rescue of a horse being whipped in the streets of Turin, just below his room on the Via Carlo Albert. He was a philologist, philosopher, writer, cultural critic, and composer in the style of Liszt. His most important books include The Will to Power, The Birth of Tragedy, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Human All Too Human, Beyond Good and Evil, The Gay Science, Genealogy of Morals, and The Twilight of the Idols. Nietzsche is most famous for having declared the death of God in the course of promoting a philosophy that would be, as he put it, true to the earth. He was a materialist, an anti-essentialist, and a critic of transcendence in all its forms. In some ways, he can be seen as a sort of upside-down Plato. Somewhat like Freud after him, he understood morality to be a historical product of the repression of the body, aided and abetted by religion, especially the Judeo-Christian tradition, and its advocacy of the ascetic ideal. He's a problematic determinist without being a fatalist, in that he thinks we can significantly affirm our own fate, called amor fati, or as we might say, be true to ourselves. He's something of a vitalist, for whom the shape of one's will to power, or one's vital energy, is the central question. He's a critic of slave morality. He describes the masses as a herd, and he promotes as a human ideal the Übermensch, or the Superman. In particular, he diagnoses as the disease of the West ressentiment, resentment, blaming others rather than taking responsibility for oneself. He was a relativist and a perspectivist, claiming that all truth was a matter of interpretation, despite the paradox that this generates. He embraced the creative power of language, declaring himself the greatest ever German stylist. He wasn't modest. Now, obviously, we could spend a lecture course on Nietzsche, but today I want to focus on one doctrine, the doctrine of the eternal return. This appears in various places and various versions of his work as a thought experiment, as a demonstrable scientific hypothesis, and as a vision. Here it's clearly an experience. And it may well be strictly incoherent. But let me read this, this quote. What if someday or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, you are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine? We've got two options. The idea of affirming the eternal return is a thought experiment, the consequence of which will be the elimination of ressentiment, including resentment at the very passage of time, and any demand for salvation or teleological purpose in history, and the demonstration that we don't need transcendence to get depth of meaning in our lives. That's the point of this idea. The irony, of course, is that it itself proposes a kind of salvation. His point, however, is to suggest that we can achieve various of the objectives of the religious life without embracing or acquiring transcendence. That is, reference to a higher realm. As with Kierkegaard and Abraham, the price we have to pay seems monstrous. Edith Piaf may sing Je ne regrette rien, but to joyfully affirm and not just accept all the useless suffering the world has seen seems to be a hysterical refusal to make discriminatory judgments, and as mindless as the claim, as it's sometimes made, that God moves in mysterious ways. Perhaps, on the other hand, we could treat the idea of affirming eternal return as a cold shower. Even imagining it to be possible gives one a vision of a world without resentment, which is genuinely enabling, even if one then realizes that that model needs adjusting. You have to bring in some sort of compassion that's not born from resentment. But let me explain what I mean by getting depth of meaning without transcendence, for this is genuinely ingenious. If we accept eternal return, everything that happens, everything we do, will reduplicate itself infinitely, indeed is already doing so. Each event is a member of a set of its own identical exemplars. Think of it, this has happened identically before, and will happen over and over again, and identically, just like this, and you can't say, yeah, I've heard this before, because you don't remember it. I mean, memory would mess up the system, as you can see. It's not that God's watching everything we do, but rather that we ourselves are faced with the question, do you really want to do that unworthy act, knowing that it will not get washed away by the afternoon rain, but will be repeated infinitely? By this imaginative device, every small thing matters. This mattering comes not by participating in an ideal form, but by being reflected infinitely in other identical moments. Infinite repetition is at one level just more of the same. It's all just one level, right? And yet out of it, nests of idiosyncratic ideality are generated. Deep, deep wells of eternity, as Nietzsche put it. And if you want an analogy here, I don't know if this is going to be helpful or not. This is what I have for you. And actually, you could pass this around. This is very special. This is a Möbius strip. And what's important about it is that it has only one surface, like existence. There's one surface. And yet at any point there are two sides, two absolutely different sides. This shows that an analogue of the immanence and transcendence relation can be constructed without changing planes, even, as it were, in infinite time. You have these repetitions, you have this sense of repetition, and hence you have meaning built into each event that wouldn't be there if you just had a series that never returned. And that's something that the thought of the eternal return achieves for Nietzsche. We're being asked to suppose that this is what being true to the earth might mean more generally. So to recap, I'm not explicitly claiming that Nietzsche is offering this full-blooded account of experience that I'm proposing. In fact, his early essay on truth is remarkably close to a stripped-down empiricism. But he does give an exceedingly active role to interpretation. This happens both at the level of confirming our ordinary everyday prejudices, but also in trying to project quite new possibilities for humanity. He says, man is not a goal, but a bridge. And I've actively interpreted his account of the eternal return to try to show how this works. Well, this, I take it, is an experience that challenges us to imagine and indeed to live otherwise. Some general comments. As will be clear, both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche draw on experience and experiences at the opposite end of the spectrum from that of discrete sense data. Heidegger will continue this interest in the affective dimension by talking about mood, our various forms of attunement to the world. These treatments have more to offer us in thinking about ethical questions, about human possibility, about the existential traction of profound metaphysical questions than providing firm foundations for the sciences. Indeed, I would suggest that they typically teach a kind of negative capability, as Keats would have it. Now, in the spirit of the quote from Nietzsche in the title of this talk, how much do I have time? Okay. In the spirit of the quote from Nietzsche and the title of this talk, let me now offer some responses or objections that might be made to what I've been saying, in the hope that if I survive them, my position will have been strengthened. Here are 7 objections. There are only 7. This is the elastic part of my talk, which I can sort of condense by just leaving them open for you if we run out of time. Here's the first one. Surely a philosopher and his or her life should be kept distinct. A bad person can be a good thinker. Isn't this focus on Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and their personal experience just confusing? Well, Heidegger once said about Aristotle, this is what I want to say about his life. He was born, he wrote, and he died. You know, enough said. I don't think that's enough. What we need to avoid, and this is, I'm sort of trying to address this problem of not confusing biography and thought. What we need to avoid are reductive and simplistic correlations and explanations. Thus, when we speak of somebody's life, we typically look at it retrospectively, rather than as lived moment to moment, sort of ongoing adventure. We usually work with reports from others, and even autobiographies, if they are access to somebody's life, are highly selective and retrospective again. And how well do we read someone's philosophy when we're trying to connect their life with their thinking? Their fundamental questions, do we really get at them? If we reduce someone's thinking, for example, to the trauma they suffered, as we might do, you read Levinas, for example, and think, yeah, there was a man who spent a while in a labor camp. Well, we forget to ask whether that trauma was illuminating or toxic, and whether or not they responded creatively to it. So I'm being very quick about this. So how much can we learn, another objection, from the experiences of others? Surely all we have are reports of experience. Why should we trust them or care? And think of what Hume's skeptical response was to reports of miracles, which was, well, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but, the odds on that, given the laws of nature, not very high. If someone else says they've seen a ghost, that's one thing. You may indeed weigh the evidence. But if you yourself see a ghost, what then? And how should or can we deal with the suffering of others, or their love and joy? Can we add them to our own experiences prosthetically to fill out our own lives? Or is that a betrayal of their ownership of those experiences? Could Christ really die for me? Really? Or have I got to do that for myself? Can we really live through films and novels or our children's exploits? Or is all this just voyeurism? Are there ways of treating powerful experiences philosophically that overcome those sorts of worries about the second hand? And how can we not share our experiences? It would be the flip side of all that. There's an understandably impatient feminist might argue something like this. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, they're just part of a long tradition of misogynistic philosophers with father problems. Get over it. It's time to move on. Well, I'm not going to give you an elaborate version of the response to that, but I would ask you and recommend you read Kelly Oliver on Womanizing Nietzsche, or her edited volume on feminist responses to Nietzsche, which basically shows how some of those late 19th century German feminists were right, that Nietzsche was unfortunately getting it right about women, and what we needed was to change the way women are. And he offers as a philosopher all sorts of tools to help sort of deconstruct male paternalistic ways of thinking. So I would say here, read Kelly Oliver, and that would help a lot. Where are we? D. Yeah, number 4. I think I'll just read out these headings and not give you the answers. It is good to move away, surely, from reductive atomic accounts of experience, but not every complexity is worth exploring. What we need is a critical approach to experience. You can't just sort of say, oh, that's an experience, wonderful. We need to, put some of them aside and take some of them more seriously. Number 5, isn't this focus on experience just wallowing in subjectivity? Experience is all very well, but what about reality? The world's going to hell in a handbasket, whether we know it or not. And I've got some definitive responses to that. And lastly, penultimately, isn't it a problem that many of these so-called experiences are incoherent when you think them through? Like, even I said, come on, eternal return doesn't make any sense. If you sort of think it through, it's not consistent. Surely from a contradiction, anything follows, logically. So why are you interested in these sort of messed up kinds of experiences? And lastly, some of this material is fascinating, but does any of it have ethical significance? What are the lessons for life? Isn't there a problem that these so-called experiences seem so often incoherent or impossible? And here I say, I will give you the answer to that one. Thinking about suffering, passivity, limits to my will, the dependency of selfhood, the fractal complexity of things, the limits of language, the fragility of our conceptual schemes, all teach one to be less arrogant, more circumspect, and perhaps a certain kind of negative capability. And this has a direct ethical significance. And interestingly, again, Wittgenstein, no, he keeps coming in, but he wrote somewhere, we do come up against the limits of language, and this I call ethics. Very interesting. In other words, what he means by that, actually language doesn't entirely present everything we need to be thinking about. There's always more. And recognizing that always more, that's an ethical stance. Well, let me admit that not all experience is valuable. Not all dreams are profound. I once read a book by J.W. Dunn, I don't know if you ever read this, called Experiment with Time, in which he argues for multiple temporal dimensions, with a particular interest in precognition, especially in dreams. He recounted one dream in particular which woke him up in the middle of the night. He had discovered the secret of the universe, and he wrote it down on a scrap of paper and went back to sleep. In the morning, he eagerly reached for the paper. He had written on the paper, "The odor of vinegar pervades everywhere." So much for dreams. Or perhaps for the meaning of the universe. Who knows, he might have actually got it right. Well, just to conclude then, I have tried to give something of the flavor of the thinking of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche as windows onto the 19th century. And with respect to these two thinkers, I began by stating the obvious, that Kierkegaard is a religious thinker and Kierkegaard's a hard-nosed atheist. This is one over...
You attributed both to Kierkegaard.
Well, that was a slip. Well, I am trying to say that actually, so what I'm trying to say was, at the beginning, I set out with the obvious assumption that, I get it right, Kierkegaard is the religious thinker and Nietzsche is the hard-nosed atheist. This is one oversimplifying schema that I hope we've started to dismantle. For Kierkegaard's God appears as a power with a capital P, for which we might devise alternative interpretations. And Nietzsche's eternal return smacks of religious intensity. And remember what he says, you are divine, to this demon who tells him this. So, are they really as opposed as you might think? I have focused on the ways in which they dealt philosophically with some powerful experiences, giving their accounts my own extra spin. I hope in doing so I've also shown something of how philosophy can be relevant to life. Philosophy may boil no cabbages, and the age of systematic construction may be over. But the questions that philosophy addresses don't go away. One way of keeping them alive is to reflect on the complex, often disturbing, sometimes joyful experiences we have, resisting reduction to existing schemes. Sometimes this means turning philosophy against philosophy. And given the Wittgensteinian impulse this reflects, mixed in with phenomenology and deconstruction, perhaps we'll see more of this in Jose's talk next week. So what about this dream that I began with, this premonitory dream? Well, I will leave to you drawing out its deep philosophical significance. But I will tell you, as I know you want to know, what was inscribed on the sole of the shoe on that abortive occasion. It says here, what does not kill you makes you stronger. But it's crossed out. And then underneath it says, back to the rough ground. Well, I recovered from that humiliation last week, or 3 weeks ago, and I thank you for coming back again to hear the real thing. So any experiences to report? Yes?
I just had a quick question. So we noticed that Nietzsche is very anti-religious against both gods there. And I had a quick question about the eternal return. Who does he think controls like, this process if he doesn't believe in God?
So I think Nietzsche would look at the way you've posed the question.
What?
He would look at the way you posed the question, like who's in control of this process. I mean, Nietzsche would, sorry, I got a bit faster. Nietzsche would ask why you think there's someone or something in control. I mean, when you look out at the trees on campus, and you say, hey, look at that tree, it's growing. Do you say, yeah, but who's controlling that? You know, you might say that, but you might just say, oh, it's the tree's relationship to the air and the water, and that's how it's going. But there might not be anything in control. And the question would be, I mean, supposing you said, I know, God is controlling this thing, right? You know what the skeptic's going to ask? He's going to ask, well, who's controlling God? Why is he doing that, or she doing that rather than that? In other words, you don't necessarily answer the question by saying, we can't go any further than this. Because the skeptic would ask, well, why not? Because you haven't really asked, where does God come from? And Nietzsche, in a sense, is trying to cut through that. The point of my Mobius strip thing is that it shows you, and this is what Nietzsche is trying to do all the time, that you don't have to posit something outside the realm that we find ourselves in to find meaning in it. That's his thought, or his trick. And it's very tempting to say, yeah, but what's behind this? What's making it happen? Right? And he's trying to wean us off that temptation. Now, you don't have to agree with him. I'm just saying that's what that's where he's going. Yeah.
So, kind of as Nietzsche wants to get us away from this guy, like I think you were talking about how he reducing things down into constantly repeating thing that we can't get out of. So, like the infinite, I use the word fractal, kind of the infinite repeating, unable to break. Kind of we're caught in that. That's what Nietzsche's saying on one hand, and then I guess kind of where I'm going with this is like the omnipresent third-party relational that kind of gives dignity to Kierkegaard's sense of self. I guess how does individual faith and that leap of faith that you mentioned Kierkegaard having in realizing that infinity? I mean, Nietzsche wants to put it in infinity, but and say that the Mobius, you can have one plane and still get meeting and still transcend.
Right.
I feel like he's putting, if you have infinite, kind of putting a mirror into the Mobius strip and making, kind of transcending it.
Wait a minute. The mirror in the Mobius strip, I've never thought of this. Next time, I'll try and devise a Mobius strip with reflective surface. Sartre once wrote a play, I think it's called We Clos, No Exit. And in that play, the one line that people remember is, hell is other people. And I think that captures the spirit of Nietzsche's thought here, that we may imagine that hellfire is, and I apologize, if people here are like waiting for the real thing, or the alternative. But Sartre wants to say that is a kind of projective thought, that hellfire is something that happens to us if we're unlucky or bad after we're dead. But there really is a meaning to hell. And if you've got the wrong neighbors, you know what that's like. In other words, hell is very real, but you don't have to, as it were, go outside the human space to find it. And so that's why when Kierkegaard says that in order to take seriously this other kind of despair, or to imagine that you could despairingly will to be yourself. In other words, you carry on, nonetheless in despair, but you carry on. How can you do that? He's saying that you can only do it if you have some sort of sense of connectedness to something outside yourself. And now that I agree with. The idea that there is something outside yourself of the sort that he's describing is not part of the argument. But that's why I say, you might believe that help is coming on a desert island and save your supplies, and you'd be quite wrong, and then by chance something turns up and you did survive, but you had no right to believe that that was true. Now in Kierkegaard's case, I take seriously the idea that this is a man who the earthquake it's like leaning on a wall that you know is going to support you. Absolutely know it's going to support you. And then it falls over. And you fall over. And that's what happened to him and his father. And I think what Kierkegaard is saying is, what we'd say psychologically, of course, is that he then looked for something that would never fall over. And it may be that demand for certainty, for a guarantee, is something that we can work through. It may be that we don't need that in the way that we think we need it, and that what we really need are good friends, or we need a good social life. We need to be emotionally connected to other people. We may be that Kierkegaard couldn't do those things. But this would be all sort of psychobabble. And I guess I'm interested in trying to think through both what he thought the connections were and how we might then work through those same issues ourselves. Yeah? Sorry, maybe... Yes?
Comment on the concept of Superman as understood by Nietzsche, and on the other hand, how that became utilized and adapted and by the Nazis. What does he mean by that, as opposed to what they ended up making it?
Well, Nietzsche got appropriated by all kinds of people in all kinds of ways. Mussolini was a fan. Richard Nixon is supposed to have, enjoyed his Nietzsche. Machiavelli would have, had he lived, and they'd said there was a portrait of Nietzsche in Hitler's bunker, but nobody knows whether Hitler actually read Nietzsche. In other words, there is a side to Nietzsche's legacy that's not good. There are anti-Semitic remarks that you can take, and certainly misogynistic remarks you can take out of Nietzsche. But there's a whole different side of this. I mean, there's the fact that Nietzsche's sister, he basically was cared for by his sister, and then when his last sort of crazy years, and then she took over the estate, and she organized the will to power in such a way, and she was anti-Semitic. She certainly tried to make him out to be a supporter of that movement. But as I understand it, the Übermensch, the Superman, is misunderstood if it's thought that this is the expression of a desire to crush and dominate in a way that is satisfying for this person. In other words, I don't think I think for Nietzsche that sense that you would get pleasure from riding roughshod over other people, that would be a weakness. That would make your pleasure dependent on your having oppressed others. I don't think that's Nietzsche's position at all. It's not about domination. I think the will to power is far more about self-expression. And I think the Übermensch captures that sense of someone who exuberantly lives what he's capable of, rather than seeking to dominate others in some sort of vulgar way. So I think it is actually a lot about a kind of withdrawal from our usual sense of victory and supremacy and so on. I think those are sort of reactive feelings and emotions that he would distance himself from. But for us, what is Über? It's Übermensch. What does Über mean? It means a being that is crossing over to... Man is a bridge over an abyss. So the overman is really, perhaps I should say, not a destiny, not a position, but a striving to a new possibility of being human, one that would be freed from this ressentiment, this resentment that I described, who would have a different way of engaging his own or her own embodiment. There's a lot of Nietzsche that's sort of attacking this ascetic refusal and rejection of the body. Yeah.
You suggest that we could benefit from an approach to experience that's neither scientific nor practical, but you still call it critical. So I'm wondering what kind of critical approach to experience can philosophy specifically provide? I'm looking at point number 4, and I could imagine someone saying, well, not if this is the case, then what is called for is a more scientific or some kind of objective approach to experience. So what is the sense and import of critical for you?
So I was listening to a radio report. No, I was reading I'm reading on my cell phone, the BBC News, and it was about Uganda. It's either Uganda or Nigeria. Just passed these sort of anti-homosexual laws, and the president or his spokesman talked about revulsion at these, acts. And I'm thinking, homophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, they all have attached to them, visceral feelings. These people are not just deducing their beliefs from some textbook. There's something in their bodies that they have experiences. But my point is, you can't just say, well, that's perfectly valid if that's your experience. You have to say, yeah, but why do you, obviously you can't necessarily just say to somebody, oh, why do you feel like that? But if you're trying to philosophically evaluate the significance of these experiences, I mean, gun owners in America genuinely feel fear and feel, and I think, as a Brit, I sort of don't understand this, I would feel fear in a country full of guns. But leaving that aside, I sort of think you've got to take these things seriously, all these feelings and emotions and attitudes, but you have to take them critically. You have to ask, how do they happen? What would alleviate them? What are they based on? So that's what I mean by a critical response to experience. I'm trying to say they are deeply complex. You haven't just got little atomic sense datas that you stick together. You've got entire ways of being in the world captured and represented by these experiences. But some of them are deeply, intolerant and involve, hatred and violence. And that's what a critical response would involve. It would take them very seriously, but it wouldn't begin to endorse them. And I'm thinking, the other example I would give you is the example of trauma, or you call it trauma, which, these sorts of experiences are incredibly powerful. They, can cripple people's lives. And you can't just say, oh, how interesting they are, being so extreme. You can't say, well, in order to really live, I really need to share with you your trauma. I don't know that you necessarily want that. Part of the thing about trauma is these are experiences that you could not process adequately, properly, and still haven't. And yet they are terribly powerful, they are terribly significant. We have to sort of think through what makes them unexperienceable and why they play the role that they do. So all I'm trying to say is that I think you need, and that philosophers, and I'm trying to explain my own position too, I'm not just saying, oh, bring me all your experiences, you're tired, I'm not just saying, bring it on, let's weigh them and see how valuable they are. I'm saying we do need to critically respond to even the experiences of our enemies and try and think them through. Yeah.
You said that Nietzsche said that man was a bridge to a place free from resentment.
Yeah.
Some people that I've talked to said that his mental insanity was that goal. Like, how would you respond? Because I actually don't personally believe that. So, like, how would you, like, A, do you believe that? And B, if you don't, how would you respond to people who would say the end goal for Nietzsche was to go insane, to escape that result?
Well, Nietzsche once said, you haven't got rid of God if you still believe in grammar. What does that mean? In other words, if you still believe that behind language there is this structure that generates all the speech that we produce, that there's something underlying that generates. In other words, that demand that there be something beneath and below is still a sort of theological demand. That's his claim anyway. And if that's true, then getting rid of God as he's describing it is a very long process, because you have to keep on examining over and over again every little, dimensional aspect of your belief structure to try and, root out those kinds of impulses, those kinds of desires. And I think the same is true with ressentiment. I mean, Nietzsche's not talking about something that, you just sort of take on and just take off like a coat. We talk about an entire culture that sort of is gripped by this feeling. I mean, if you accept his analysis. And that means that obviously if you staked your life on trying to get rid of it or see its end, then you'd be disappointed or you'd go crazy. But I don't think for a moment that's what sent Nietzsche crazy. I do think he was, it's interesting, that episode that I described of him, on a street in Turin, which is supposed to be the time when he went crazy, when he sees this horse being beaten because it won't pull the cart that he's supposed to be pulling, and he interposes himself between the whip and the horse and grabs and then stops the horse being beaten and then collapses. And people say, well, the guy's crazy, right? And I'm thinking, well, no, this is not a crazy man. This is actually somebody whose heart was in the right place. I mean, this is somebody who's oversensitive, maybe, to the cruelty of the world. And I could see, someone saying, well, that kind of person really can't live in this world. It's just too brutal, too awful. And look at what they do to horses. Nietzsche's father died when he was 5 of, possibly a brain tumor. We don't know, but it's something. The rumor is that he died of some sort of brain problem, and Nietzsche certainly thought that he was, a bit like Kierkegaard, doomed to maybe repeat that same fate. Some people have, said he might have had syphilis, and this, infected his brain and led to his collapse. I mean, it might be he just didn't have enough, lithium. He needed, modern pharmaceutical treatment. I don't know. But if I take this for the philosophical side of what you're saying, I would say that, Nietzsche, thought that only, I think, was it 5 or 7 people in the world had ever understood him. So he did think of his task as, like climbing a mountain. But there are plenty of people who thought that, who haven't gone crazy when they realized it wouldn't happen. I did think he had a momentous task, and I think to the extent that we continue that journey of being true to the earth, it's not over. Yeah.
I want to add to the Superman thing, coming from another angle, how the positive, where the people who created the comic book were influenced by Nietzsche and creating Superman as a hero.
Is that right?
Not as a race to destroy, but a race to help. Due to the Jewish creators, who I think the father was murdered, and he wanted to create a more powerful person to protect people who couldn't protect themselves.
Wow.
But also, a second thing is that I don't feel about the gun ownership thing.
I shouldn't have mentioned that.
No, it's okay.
I know I'm going to get fired from CNN now.
I don't feel fear that I need to own a gun, but I just have them, like I have a car. And that's basically it.
And so you need a gun to protect the car, is that?
No, I have a gun like I have my dog, like I have some DVDs. And,
Okay.
I have.
No, I was just thinking about Piers Morgan, who's just apparently been fired from his TV show because, and I thought I mustn't talk about gun ownership.
Well, but I'm not upset about that.
Okay, thank you. I think I got one up here first.
Is the concept of eternal return one that when Nietzsche came up with it in like the early 1800s,
was it one that wasn't widely accepted, especially when the culture was westernized, because people in general were more religious back then than they are now?
Well, he came up with it in the late 1800s.
Late 1800s.
Yeah, and it's written about in various of his books from, about 1886 onwards. And I don't think it's because people were, and it's hard to know about people anyway. I mean, people in this country are much more religious than they are in Europe, even now. But I don't think it's because of the religiousness or otherwise of his readers that this idea was accepted or not accepted. I honestly don't think many people have signed up to the eternal return at all. And what I've tried to do with it is to show you how interesting it is as a thought experiment. And he describes it certainly as an experience that, a demon comes to you and says this stuff. But I don't think, honestly, there's like a
Line between religion and acceptance.
I don't think there are lots of people who have ever said, yeah, eternal return, that's our shtick. Yes, this lady here.
Can you discuss briefly Nietzsche's transition from no to yes, as was described by Colin Wilson, The Outsider, when he was able to transition to write something like Prospect Zarathustra, which was a change?
No, from no to, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, from a nihilistic position
yeah.
to what I find to be a more joyous, affirmative position, if you're from Zarathustra.
There's a wonderful joke about a mousetrap, which I will not tell you, because it takes too long. But the moral of the story is that the absence of a ground to your life and our existence can really be thought of in the most desperate terms. Why am I here? Why are you here? Why are we here? I mean, what is the point of it? We're all going to die. I mean, is that completely meaningless? Now that takes you off in one direction, right? But you could say to yourself, my goodness, I'm actually alive. This is unbelievable. Every breath is a miracle. And instead of focusing on this sense of absence and loss, you can think, I'm going to make every last second count. And that, I haven't talked about Nietzsche, but I mean, it seems to me that's the option that he's offering in relation to the eternal return. He's saying you can turn this sense of the missing, what's not here, around, and see it as a source of celebration. But it does require a change in your sense of what you need to be happy, what you need to go on, and so on. Because if you're looking for something that will never disappoint you, something that will be always permanent, something that will always be there, a fixed point, you may not get that, ever. And if you can wean yourself off from needing it or wanting it, you may be able to start a different life. And I think that's actually the double attitude towards nihilism that Nietzsche had. Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of times when we're asking questions about like what value is kind of or could potentially be gained from studying a given thinker or a given school of thought, we ask what would the world at large stand to gain if more time and energy were spent on studying like whoever the thinker in question is. But with Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and especially Nietzsche, it seems like they very deliberately limited their audience, right? Like they were speaking to a very select part of the population rather than the world at large. And so, in saying that that Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are still worth studying, how democratic, I guess, do you think the value of studying Kierkegaard and Nietzsche is? Is it going to make the world better, or is it going to make a select few people better?
Well, Kierkegaard had a genuine impact on Copenhagen, and he did write lots of squibs and responses, and he was engaged in public commentary and discussion and argument and so on. So he was a public intellectual, and if you'd been in Nashville, he would be somebody you'd know about. And I don't think you could say, well, Kierkegaard was just writing for a small group of people. He was engaged with a serious urban public, and then he wrote a bunch of books which have got an incredible. They've been dispersed and disseminated all over the planet. Now Nietzsche, you look at Zarathustra, and there's this guy who comes down from the top of the mountain, a bit like Moses, with his revelations, and says, now I've got to tell people, I've discovered all this wonderful stuff. And he tries to talk to the people in the market square, and they are not interested in this stuff. He tries to talk about the Übermensch, and they say, no, we're waiting for the tightrope walker who's going to walk across the square on the rope. That's what we're interested in. But so Nietzsche was very, and he was terribly disappointed. But what's interesting is Nietzsche dramatizes the difficulty of communicating with a mass audience in Zarathustra, precisely. And when you read this, you think, poor guy, he's trying to talk to these people in the marketplace who don't understand him, but I do, because I can understand his problem talking to ordinary people. And so, in a sense, Nietzsche actually dramatizes the very problem that you're raising. And it's not surprising that that book has sold all the way around the world, and Nietzsche's had more impact than any 19th century philosopher I can think of. So don't feel sorry for their lonely existence. But then you say, well, how democratic is it? Now, it could be in terms of access to the thought. I would say total democracy. You can probably download most of his books online. Is he a Democrat? No, he's not. But in democracies, you want to read people who aren't Democrats, and he's got all kinds of interesting criticisms of democracy. So he's in some ways an elitist, but he's an interesting elitist who actually wants everyone to rise to the level that he's describing. So he's not an exclusive elitist. He's just got very high aspirations for human beings.
One more question.
Okay, one more. Yep.
My question actually stems from on the three metamorphoses. Someone up here brought up yes and no earlier, which got me thinking about that.
Yeah.
So my biggest question is, since Nietzsche's looking to ground everything in experience so much, how would he first of all explain the phenomenon of no, being that it is negative?
Yeah.
And then what would the upshot of that be for the way in which we live our lives? So I'm basically trying to see how it works.
So I think the quick answer is that he talks about these three metamorphoses, these three transformations. The second of which is the lion, who he says has to destroy, and he destroys basically moralism and the burden of guilt. But the lion, he says, can't create. Can just destroy. But you need to go through this destructive stage to get to the third stage, which he calls the child. Innocence, rebirth. But the child can't do that unless the lion has been there to destroy, in a sense, the obstacles that it would otherwise encounter. And the quick formula for this is that creation and destruction are inseparable. That you have to destroy to create. But what you're destroying may not be worth keeping. You may need to get rid of it in order to make something else happen, to let something else happen. And of course, that then gets you into all sorts of interesting questions about, what you mean by destruction, and whether you aren't really transforming something, or whether you're returning something to its original power and force, and so on. So these words, again, are weighted and freighted with ambiguities. So even if we said, yes, you've got to destroy in order to create, obviously there are times when you want to draw in the forces that have got lost in that thing you think you just want to destroy. Are there any? One more question? Did you say? Yes?
Is there one of Nietzsche's works in particular that you consider particularly close to your heart?
My heart?
Or,
Where is that?
I hate to ask people, like, what is your favorite blank? Because I find it to be sort of banal and contrived. But is there...
Well, yeah, I mean...
You know what I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, you can't go wrong with Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I mean, it's a good read. And it's also, pretty deep. But if you wanted a short book, just like when you're waiting for the dentist or something, Twilight of the Idols. No, they're not. What am I? That's Twilight of the Idols. It's full of, lots of brief vignettes, and you can dip in and out. That's really good. Yeah. Okay.